Hello everyone and good afternoon. I'm going to try not to deconstruct this. Um, the historian Thomas Carlyle once called economics the dismal science. He was writing at a time when the most popular economic theory was Malthusianism. This was the idea by Thomas Malthus that as the population increases, you'd run out of food and therefore everyone would starve and die. So, very dismal. In fact, you could say that the contemporary inheritor of Thomas Malthus's ideas are what we call the neoliberals or neoclassical economics, right? The ones who always come and tell us we have to do austerity, we have to tighten our belts, and so on and so forth. Anyway, here we are today, a very gloomy Tuesday. I think it's approaching lunchtime. Maybe some of you need an urgent bathroom break. But here we are, we're stuck here, we're talking about the dismal science, economics. The silver lining is we're trying to talk about an alternative. If economics is a dismal science, I would like to propose that an alternative should be hopeful, but it should still be a science. I think in the last couple of decades, with the onslaught against the left and the decline of what we call actually existing socialism in the Soviet Union, neoliberalism, financialization, so on and so forth. A lot of progressive movements have sort of taken a back foot. We're defending the gains that we made in the previous decades. We're defending the welfare state, or we're defending free education, free healthcare, so on and so forth. And that puts us in a back foot because we can never really come forward and put forward a positive agenda of actually what we like to see beyond the things that we won so many decades ago. Now, in this current IMF program, I think the most common criticism that we can have, and a very correct one I might add, a very necessary one, is a criticism about austerity. We all know that by cutting public spending, raising taxes on working people, the government effectively curtails the consumption of the working masses. This leads to their pauperization. We know that the lack of funding for education, healthcare, and transport can have devastating consequences. We don't need statistics, although they're useful. We can see it with our own eyes. It was around 2023, even before we went to the IMF, that the government started implementing these policies. 15% of people lost their jobs. Industrial electricity consumption declined by 20%. And according to some research, around 7.1 million people fell into poverty. Just for perspective, 7.1 million people is more than the population of the Western province. But going beyond that, in our critiques of austerity, of course, we focus on the welfare state, on social safety nets, quite rightly so. This is where the effects of austerity are most immediately apparent, where we can measure it, where we see the human impact. But I want to add that austerity hurts not just the welfare state, but the entire productive economy, the economic base that sustains everything else. This is because austerity hits public investment the hardest. And it's much more complicated to measure the impact of that. What are the social impacts of declining public investment? When public works come to a virtual standstill, when infrastructure starts to deteriorate, how do you measure those externalities? We know a couple of weeks ago, something like 21 people died in a bus crash in Kotmale. How does that get accounted, right? I mean, a lot of the news coverage talks about was the driver drunk, was it raining, what was the conditions of the weather, and so on and so forth. But I would argue this is something we can put to the tally of neoliberalism. This is the result of deteriorating public infrastructure, the lack of investment in public infrastructure. So I'm going to give you two quick estimates from the 2025 budget speech. Estimate 1. 41% of government expenditure will go towards paying interest on debt. Less than 20% will go towards public investment. What's the objective result of such low investment rates? It's low growth, high unemployment, economic stagnation, and continued poverty. The latest World Bank figures for Sri Lanka forecast a growth rate of about 3.5% this year, 3.1% next year, 3.1% again the year after that. Are these rates that we should be happy with as a poor, fairly underdeveloped country? In my opinion, they're completely abysmal. If you look at, for example, the People's Republic of China, when it was at the same GDP per capita that we are today, it was growing at around 9%. Japan, when it was at the same GDP per capita that we are today, 8%. Korea, South Korea, when it was at the same GDP per capita that we are today, 13%. So should we be satisfied with 3%? I really don't think so. I'm going to put forward a very simple proposition. An economy cannot grow without investment. It's not left-wing, it's not right-wing, it's just an objective economic fact. You need investment. And according to some research that I've been involved with an organization called the Tricontinental Institute and Global South Insights, there's a virtually perfect mathematical correlation between what we call net fixed capital investment and GDP growth. Let me explain net fixed capital investment. We know that every economy has basically a stock of existing assets, right? Machinery, buildings, so on and so forth. Over time, these depreciate, right? You need to reinvest in them to maintain the existing things. Roads need to be repaved, buildings need to be repainted, and so on. What we call net fixed capital investment is the investment over and above what you do to maintain your existing assets. Simply put, it's building stuff. Building new stuff, roads, bridges, schools, hospitals, factories, machines, so on and so forth. The countries I mentioned earlier, China, Japan, Korea, there's a lot more we could add to the list, Vietnam, all of them sustained such high growth rates because they were able to invest in their economy. They had a very high ratio of net fixed capital investment as a share of GDP. Sri Lanka is a very interesting case because we're not a rich country. But if you look at our statistics, investment is a very small part of overall GDP. The highest share is actually consumption. So we have some of the highest rates of consumption in the region. It's over 76% of GDP. The irony is that, when you say that we have high consumption, you would think people are living well, but they're not. Most people live a hand-to-mouth existence. For example, you look at World Bank figures, they say that around 25% of the population lives in poverty. But that's by the standard they use for lower middle income countries. If we raise our standards to those of a higher middle income country, then 65% of our population lives in poverty. The point is that investment is needed to grow the economy, and it's only through investment that people can actually increase their real consumption to come out of poverty. Now, I want to emphasize that this is not a problem that's unique to Sri Lanka. In fact, the majority of the population in the global south are stuck in these sort of IMF debt austerity cycles. The UN itself estimates that there's something like a $4 trillion investment gap for developing countries to meet the sustainable development goals. The problem is this kind of investment is really not forthcoming in the current financialized economic order. FDI has basically not kept pace with GDP and growth, so there's no FDI panacea waiting around the corner, sorry to inform. What little FDI actually exists, the data from the UN suggests that most of it goes into the service sector, most of it is short-term financial flows. So they don't actually crystallize into real fixed investments in the economy. And in the meantime, I think there's a growing agreement now that the multilateral financing system is basically broken. The World Bank doesn't give us the investments that we need. There's a severe lack of an international development bank for the global south. So all this time, we in the global south were told, in the era of neoliberalism, that all you have to do is follow the script. You have to privatize, liberalize, etc., and the investments will come and you will grow. But that's not actually what happened. I'm saying that the neoliberals, who always talked about investment and always talked about growth, that their own prescription doesn't deliver that. I actually have nothing against the idea of investment and growth, and I think no one should when we live in such, I hate to use the word backward, I know it's a very loaded term, but really the conditions are so severe that it compels you to use words like that. But that brings me to the next part of my intervention. If we agree that we need investment, what is it we should be investing in? What's the investment that's needed that can guarantee the next investment, that can guarantee a self-perpetuating cycle of growth, right? So we can escape from the self-perpetuating cycle of almost degrowth, which the IMF pushes us in. If any of you have read my previous works, I think what I'm about to say next is probably not going to be new. It's industrialization. It's manufacturing. Historically speaking, every single country that developed did so through industrialization, starting from the Industrial Revolution in Europe, in the United Kingdom, in the US, Germany, Japan, the so-called East Asian tigers, China and Vietnam today. For latecomers, like Sri Lanka, industrialization is always a state-led process. Even if the state itself doesn't finance an investment through monetary financing, it creates an incentive structure to guide investment into those strategic areas, into the basic industries, the bread and butter industries. It encourages workers to gain skills over time. It introduces an industrial culture. But that requires an utmost level of clarity at the level of not just the state, but also the government and the party and civil society. That kind of broad consensus is needed to deliver on these urgent tasks. Industrialization is not just a mechanistic process of building one factory after another. It's a process of social transformation. It's a process where one thing leads to another, where basic industries lead to supporting industries, where an entire productive ecosystem is created. Interestingly, now there is more and more research, actual empirical research to back this up. UNIDO, for example, has done some recent research where they found that 64% of all growth episodes in countries over the last 50 or so years were fueled primarily by rapid development of the manufacturing sector. So it's really hard to imagine any sort of development without manufacturing, without industrialization. Few points need to be made in this context, coming back to Sri Lanka. First, Sri Lanka's manufacturing output has basically flatlined since 2012, right? So it predates all of these recent crises we talk about. It predates COVID, it predates the Easter attacks, predates the debt default and so on. 2012, right? This is over 10 years ago. So the crisis has been a long time coming. And 2012 also, it's sort of the peak post-war financialization bubble, real estate. There was really no vision about having an industrial economy at that time. Okay, second point. If you look at factory capacity utilization today, capacity utilization basically means, you have a certain amount of productive capacity. What portion of that is actually used in the production process? So in 2024, it was 62%, right? 62. In 2019, it was 81%. That means over time, capacity utilization has been dropping, right? There's more and more idle factories. There's been no real production happening. If you look at the apparel industry, it's much worse. And given the uncertainty that's happening in the global economy now, Trump's tariffs and how export-oriented our manufacturing is, this is really worrying about the state of the manufacturing sector. My third and final point is that new investment in manufacturing has basically been muted or non-existent. If you look from 2019 to 2024, only 26% of foreign investments from the BOI have been in manufacturing. This means that over 70% are in services. So like I said earlier, there's no FDI fix that's around the corner that's going to come for the manufacturing sector. We have to find ways to do it ourselves. So taken all together, you can see that this is a very alarming situation for the Sri Lankan manufacturing sector. And I want to emphasize that this really ties into the IMF program as well, because there is no consideration about the productive economy, about the external sector. It's all budget deficit, budget deficit, budget deficit. But as the last three presentations have, I think, tried to explain the nature of money, that's not the real problem here. That's not the real constraint. Anyway, all these economists in all these investment forums, they talk about services, they talk about turning Sri Lanka into a Singapore will be a great financial hub and so on and so on. They never talk about the fact that Singapore has over 120 semiconductor factories, right? When Singapore started, it was manufacturing hard drives. It wasn't tourism and banks running the show, right? So when we talk about, creating a Singapore, for some reason, this conversation never comes into the picture. Cities like London and New York would not have existed if you didn't have cities like Manchester and Detroit manufacturing real things. It's actually manufacturing profits that percolate in the economy and create services. Then they talk about productivity, innovation, R&D, all these lovely buzzwords that we have today. First of all, making workers work overtime is not productivity. It's exploitation. Suppressing wages disincentivizes innovation, right? Innovation comes in a high-wage economy, not in a low-wage economy. Second, most innovations originate within the manufacturing process, right? So it's things that are invented in manufacturing that become used in agriculture and used in services to boost the productivity of those sectors. And there's data to back this up. If you look at OECD data, right? Manufacturing-oriented private firms are the main firms that invest in R&D. So you have government after government scrambling to squeeze money out of the budget so the state can invest in R&D. But in any developing economy, it's the manufacturing firms that develop and spend on R&D. It doesn't necessarily have to be the state. The state has to create an incentive structure that encourages manufacturing firms to rise in the first place. Basically, you need domestic industrial capacity to have innovation, to deliver high wages, to safeguard economic sovereignty. I mean, the West, the global North now is no longer shy about this. They're very blatant when they talk about. They don't talk about values anymore. They don't talk about free trade, democracy, blah blah blah. They talk about national interest, and they say that their national interest is to have more production in their country, to safeguard their technological advantages. In a way, it's a good thing, right? There's no facade anymore. Just to quickly conclude, basic point. We're talking about alternatives. Sri Lanka needs an industrial policy. To do that, we have to rebuild our state capacity. We need to conduct a survey of our domestic resources, identify areas for value addition. We really have to work with our people, our labor force, which is our main asset. We need to increase their nutrition, their scientific and technical skills. We need to build infrastructure necessary for a smooth industrial system. Normally when we talk about infrastructure, it's always, can we have new AC cabins for tourists or something like that. No, we need industrial infrastructure, right? So the things our workers produce can be transported also by our workers and benefit everyone as a whole and not just a small class of people. There was a time when industrial policy was taboo. In fact, there's an IMF paper from a couple of years ago, I think, which calls it the policy that shall not be named. But more and more people are now naming it. And I think in Sri Lanka too, we need to start naming this. Between 2017 and 2023, there's a study that showed that the use of industrial policy increased ninefold, right? So it increased by 9 times. And from that increase, 2/3 were by the advanced countries themselves, not the developing countries, the developed countries. So the IMF and the ambassadors and all, they come to us and they say, open up your markets, free trade, blah, blah, blah. But they are the ones who are most prodigiously using industrial policy. It all comes down to the international division of labor, right? Countries like us are stuck at the bottom, right? Only the global North is allowed to command science and technology. We have to live at their mercy. That's what they expect. They build machines, and we should be satisfied having our people, pluck tea in plantations, serve tea in a hotel, and so on and so forth. They make sewing machines, dyes, accessories, they design the clothes, and we are supposed to be satisfied with having our people assemble these at very low wages in a factory. This international division of humanity, not just labor, can't continue. And I'd like to be optimistic and think that there is significant potential now for us to at least start having these conversations on how we can break through this impasse. Thank you.